Hi everyone. This is Phil Illy here. I'm here with Ray Alex Williams, and he's a YouTuber. I'm sure basically everyone that watches my channel is already familiar with him. He's a detransitioner, so male to male detransitioner of autogynephilic ideology, and yeah, he's been putting out a lot of content over the last year or so, and it honestly is what got me into actually making YouTubes, because I was just impressed with his output, and so I wanted to join in. And yeah, so thanks for coming on my little bitty channel, Ray.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Yeah, I'm really happy to be here because, if it wasn't for you, then I would probably not have this level of knowledge of who I am and what's actually what my problems in life are. and and yeah, you just help me understand myself and my sexuality so much more. And I just have so much clarity in my mind, which has been tremendously helpful in my detransition process. So yeah, it was watching your interviews first was the thing that really just light bulb moment. And it was particularly the way you describe things in a scientific way, which is important to me to have that sort of neutral description of what's happening, kind of separate from any kind of value judgments or anything like that. I always appreciate that you're very descriptivist in your analysis of this. You rarely, if ever, make normative value judgments. So I feel like that's just kind of your style. So that was really helpful to me. So
It feels really good when I hear feedback like that. That my book and podcast interviews have helped people understand themselves better, because it just seems so important with how confusing it can be to be autogynephilic and not have the proper conceptual framework to think it
right,
through.
like I always I always knew that I had this history of what I would consider cross-dressing fetishism or something. That was kind of the language that I would like to use to describe my relationship to cross-dressing and stuff prior to my transition when I was 28. So I and even once I transitioned, I was aware that that was part of my past. I knew that I didn't call them euphoria boners. I think that's a more recent term,
Yeah.
more recent t- terminology. But yeah, I just always kind of knew that there was this arousal component, but because that component went away or diminished when I actually started my transition, and I just read Julia Serrano, and Julia Serrano's debunking and critiques of AGP, that I just got it in my head that this is pseudoscience or transphobic or something. And partly it was just the language. I didn't like the language of it. I didn't like thinking of myself as a heterosexual male because that's kind of
Yeah.
the typology is it's the homosexual transsexual versus the non-homosexual transsexual. Just well, that's transphobic because you're not referencing it based on the gender identity. You're referencing based on natal sex, and in trans world, you're not supposed to make any sort of comparison relative to your natal sex. Your natal sex becomes completely irrelevant. It's just this accidental thing in your past that's completely irrelevant to who you are. So that was just kind of my one of my big issues was I just thought it was framed in a transphobic vocabulary. And I think that's honestly one of the big reasons why so many um, you know, unenlightened normie AGPs don't like the theory, just because they just that basic terminology of HSTS versus non-homosexual is just yeah, I don't know.
They don't like anything that that is anchored to birth sex.
Right.
Yeah,
Right.
and it's kind of unavoidable. I've found, like, when I was originally writing my book, I was trying to use language that would work more with the gender identity way of thinking, but I just found that there was no clear way to speak while still working within that framework, and I had to use language that was anchored to birth sex to be unambiguous, and just basically clear about what I was saying.
Right. And I think with the whole birth sex thing, like, you know, it's like always been like AMAB versus AFAB, assigned male birth, and there's like assigned male business. That was always like the language, but I now see some trans activists, trans people like sort of wanting to reject even that language as being too bioessentialist and like, which
Yeah.
is so funny to me because like kind of organically in these trans communities, like everyone's like using that vocabulary of like AMAB versus AMAB or AFAB versus AMAB to like reinvent the sex binary and like make important like sociological like distinctions based on that. So for example, like, oh, I'm an AFAB looking for a roommate, AFAB only, because that's important to me. It's like, you'll see that in like the trans community. And it's like, but like now, like that is too much too. So like, but I'm like honestly convinced that like there's no like coherent like way for them to like talk about these things that makes sense. It's just sort of like this incoherent fuzziness, and because every trans activist kind of defines things slightly differently in their own way, it just becomes like the whole community is just like a conceptual mess. And but like, yeah, I think it's running away from um birth sex because they just don't think that's relevant to anything. They're just like, yeah, I would only ever need to know that in like some weird medical setting, but otherwise it has zero impact on any of my thoughts, behaviors, psychology, feeling, experience, socialization, anything. So yeah, which
Yeah,
is like part of like the dysphoria aspect is like
yeah, there's no, I think that inevitably people are going to come up with categories that map onto reality to some extent, and that's gonna include noticing biological sex, and so even if they recreate some new versions of AMAB and AFAB, eventually it will coalesce. It's gonna map onto the same categories again, and the euphemistic treadmill just it's not gonna lead anywhere. Like,
right,
there's no escaping biological sex and the fact that we need words to, refer to it, but,
right,
um, the resistance to it, I think, arises out of, like, the individual psychopathology of being autogynephilic or autoangiphilic, that it makes you want to reject your birth sex and any characteristics associated with it and become more like the other sex to the greatest extent possible, and so it's that I don't think there will ever be the trans community as a whole, I don't think they will ever accept language that clearly delineates in terms of sex.
yeah.
It's just it goes against the psychology of the condition, but, I
How
don't
many
yeah.
AGPs do you think truly do have that sort of like all-encompassing desire to totalize the embodiment of the opposite sex in every single dimension? Or, you know, how many are the sort of more like AGAMP type where like they're fine being this sort of like um, she-male or whatever. It's sort of like, there I think there's like actually a pretty large contingent. And I actually think it's like the majority of like AGPs that are out there, like identifying as trans, that they sort of are they don't actually desire to be totally like the opposite sex in every single sense. I think there's part of there's I think they sort of like being um this kind of in between thing. I think that's part of like the like development. And then as far as like the ideological thinking in terms of like the rejection of like the birth sex and like running away from like the sex binary. I think that's not strictly just like the psychopathology of AGP. I think that's partly like an ideological social contagion that comes out of like too much queer theory and Judith Butler being, it just becomes like a politically correct way to think in these communities rather
Well,
than like pure psychopathology.
I think, I guess what I mean is that that sort of community level, the social level way of um, thinking about it, sort of what will be the approved line of thought, will ultimately be something that is that is in line with the individual psychopathologies of all the people. Basically, the trans ideology, I don't see it as something that was like chosen, but is more, it was the subject. It evolved through discourse within the trans community over time, and statements that were pleasing and did not invalidate other people's identities rose to the top, and claims that sort of conflicted with that sort of imperative to respect everyone's identity, and the idea that you could become the other sex to the greatest extent possible. I think um, they were ideas that didn't fit in with that desire were outcompeted, and sort of the ideology um, evolved on its own.
Right. Yeah, because even back when I was, trans identified, like I never, I mean, I sort of did the whole like, I went through a brief period of having like a binary identification of like I'm like a woman or whatever, but eventually I moved past that pretty quickly, and I spent the majority of my transition identifying as like trans feminine, non-binary, or something. Is it's sort of like rather than like my gender identity being woman, it was like trans feminine was like the literal gender identity that I
Something
would
attainable.
that yeah, because it's like I could defend it philosophically because like I
Mhm.
knew that if I said like, hey, my gender identity is woman, I was just so familiar with these philosophical tricks of like, well, what does that mean? How do you define that? What's like the philosophical basis for your identity? And I kind of knew that was like impossible to give a non stereotyped definition of what a woman is outside of reductionistic biological definitions of like woman equals adult human female. So I was just like, well, I'm not going to play that game. So I'm just going to identify as the thing that I can like defend philosophically. But I think like maybe that's like a quirk to me that I care about having like philosophically coherent like definitions. I think maybe most people just don't worry about that as much, or like, um, but
Yeah,
I,
people. Not
yeah,
everyone cares about like whether their identity maps onto reality and is defensible.
yeah, which is weird because like AGPs tend to be more, I think, like theoretical or at least like more like techie computer science type
The ones you
people.
encounter online.
Yeah, like the online ones, like which seems like they have the capacity to appreciate like abstraction and these sort of like conceptual analysis games. I just feel like it's like too easy to just use your intellectual capacities to rationalize like wacky gender theories because like it's kind of like I'm not sure if you've ever read much like continental philosophy or sort of these people
Nah.
like in that world, which sort of is like the same philosophical world as like Ju- Ju- Judith Butler, where it's just once you develop this like language game of gender theory or queer theory or whatever, it's just like it's so easy to bullshit. Like no one can like call you on it because it's like it's just like lots of jargon and you know yeah, and like throwing around like morality and accusations of like power and just so yeah, I don't know. um
Yeah. So I was thinking about asking you some questions about your experience with autogynephilia. Um And I guess a good place to start would be, what were some of your earliest memories in life of sort of thoughts or behaviors that you think are likely from autogynephilia?
One of the earlier ones, this is all sort of like fuzzy. Um, I don't have like super clear memories of this, but I do remember having like daydreams and dreams about basically being like captured by like gangs of girls and like forced to wear girls' clothes. So it's sort of like
Nice.
a forced forced feminization
Yeah.
daydream, and I was very young. I mean, they weren't like explicitly like erotic and like or anything, but that was sort of like it was this idea of like yeah, just like fantasizing about these scenarios. And so that was the early memory. I have some other early memories of like um, sort of like playing house with like this girl in like Sunday school, and this sort of like I remember sort of like being treated or like as like a girl, and I remember like liking this in some scenario, and it's just like this one is like I don't know if you know that or if you experience this, but like s- sometimes your only memory is just like it's like a flash. It's like you
Right, just
can't
like a snapshot.
yeah, and you can't
Yeah.
really describe much detail, but you sort of like know the like emotional import of that. And like I know I have this like image, it has something to do with like me and like a like yeah, we were playing house to some degree or another. And I just remember like there was something about that was like has an AGP ish memory that sticks out in my mind. The way I was being treated by this girl that I was like playing with. So that's like a super early one. And then also like I would steal my mom would wear like stockings to like church, and then they get runs in them and you throw them in the trash, and I would like steal them out of the trash. Like I had this like little collection hidden in my room of like stockings because I was like very and that was probably like the earliest manifestation of like my fascination with like feminine things was like focus on like stockings and pantyhose and stuff like this. And it was
Yeah, what
particularly
age were you?
oh gosh, it was before I was 10. So I know it was pretty early. Um I don't have like the exact like date or age
Alright.
range. But it was pretty young. Um and I was fascinated with like the texture, like the feeling, and particularly like something about like how it like encases your skin and like this like feeling of like I don't know, it's something like there's something very unique from like a textural sensation perspective when it comes to like um
Yeah, sorta like the embrace of it, like, it
yeah,
squeezes
it's
you
like
a little
yeah,
bit.
like it squeezes you, it's like an embrace, and it's like kind of fascinating because I've heard that so in like in Temple Grandin's book about like her like autism, she talks about these like squeeze machines that she built. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
like I kind of think that the pantyhose or the stocking, that sort of feeling of like encasement is sort of like a similar like stress relief thing, like psychologically of like like the feeling of squeezing is like feels good or something, and it's like something about that. But basically, like that early activity developed into a specific fetish, like and like fetish in these sort of like actual sense of like you know a deep sexual fascination with like a non-human object. And so yeah, that is like stuck with me to this day. I still have that same fetish, so it's like it's definitely one of those things where it um like early childhood imprinting. And like I think it's not and I think and partly it's just like I think like that item of clothing is like so taboo because it's like one of the very clear things that like my mom would wear that like boys and men do not wear. It's like, yeah, like, women can wear trousers, men can wear trousers, women can wear shoes, um, men can't shoes, but only women are socially allowed to wear stockings and pantyhose. So it's one of these like taboo things. And I'm sure at some point I probably saw like, a Sears catalog of like some woman in like lingerie and like stockings and sort of like that classic like um, cross-dressing fascination with like, lingerie and stockings and all these things. Like, I'm sure there's like some early childhood stuff there with, various like, you know, encounters with like femininity, sort of like, a Victoria's Secret commercial or, like the,
Right.
like
I
the,
mean, that
the
stuff's also at eye level when you're very like a toddler age, stockings
yeah,
are, like, at your actual height. Like, you would
yeah.
actually be very visually close to them.
Yeah, and I've seen some other people, like, speculate that, like, the young boys are, like, grabbing their mother's, like, ankles or whatever as, like, young children, and that's sort of, like, early sensational or that early sensation sort of, like, can trigger these, like, fetishes. And I kind of think it's how, like, most fetishes start. It's like, like, why are some people really into, like, rubber boots? I don't know. It's probably because, like, they touched a rubber boot and, like, randomly had, like, a feeling of, like, arousal associated with that, and that just, like, correlation, because like, neurons that fire together wire together, so, like, I'm sure just basic neurological association, just kinda mapped that, and I think I've read, like, the reason why foot fetishes are so common is because like in like the brain, the like homunculus that maps our body, like the mapping for the genital area is very close to the mapping for the foot area for sensation. So like there's like easy for cross wiring going on. So I think like it's probably something that has to do with like the stockings and stuff, like some kind of like cross wiring or something, or
But
cross.
yeah, it's, like, related to the attraction to feet.
Yeah. I don't have
Yeah.
I don't have a foot fetish, but I do have a a fetish for stockings.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was probably like my earliest stuff. And then, I would like most young AGPs, like, I didn't have a sister, so I would like, occasionally steal my mother's clothing when I had the rare opportunity to have the house to myself, which is very rare. It did not happen that often. So this was like a once in a blue moon thing.
Once or twice a year sorta thing, probably.
Yeah, and I think that sort of like um anticipation and excitement and like looking forward to when I had the house to myself and sort of like these sort of like the sheer novelty and the thrill and the sort of like the taboo and the feelings of like shame because I kind of knew it was like it felt wrong to some degree or another, and like I'm not sure like where that feeling of wrongness comes from. Partly because like I like knew I had to hide it. I knew it was something that I just kind of like intuited through all the messages I learned socializing as like a young boy, that like this interest I had was something I had to hide from my parents, from my brother. Um, and I think that feeling of like taboo and like that like social taboo, I think is like critical to the development of like kink and fetish and paraphilia. So I think that is like the key, because even going back to Freud, Freud wrote like a book on like taboo, and like he recognized that like taboo was like key to understanding like the unconscious nature of sexuality, and like so much of it comes from like what is socially taboo, and with our male social roles and female social roles, like around clothing and acting and behaviors, like there's things that are just like very clearly taboo for young boys. Like for me, like it was like stockings and pantyhose.
Yeah. I guess with regards to Freud, like, I don't think he's overall been replicated very well, so to speak, in terms of, modern research, but he did have some really interesting ideas. Um,
Yeah, I think it's like I appreciate Freud just because from like a conceptual distinction, just like recognizing that there is an unconscious. Even if like his model of the unconscious was wrong, he was still one of the very first people in Western civilization to make a distinction between what is now considered like system one and system two and like dual process theory, where like you have like Daniel Kahneman's thinking fast and slow, like that
Yeah.
distinction between like the fast system and the slow system. Like Freud recognized that like a long time ago. So even if every other detail that he uh, got wrong, like just recognizing that fundamental distinction was like uh, monumental and foundational for the history of psychology. So I always have a deep appreciation for Freud. So I don't like it when people dismiss him as being completely irrelevant, because he's like, um, yeah, he got a lot of stuff right. It's just like the details were wrong. Um,
Yeah. With your autogynephilia, like when did you really start noticing it? Was it like during puberty?
yeah, it's probably uh through during puberty. Yeah, I just like started masturbating more. And like
Yeah, as one
um
does, yeah.
yeah, but it's funny because I was masturbating before I went through puberty, which I don't know how common that is, but it didn't uh it didn't lead to orgasm. It was just like constant. It's like it was like weird. It was like this like sustained pleasure. And then when I started going through puberty, like I was like suddenly that pleasure came to an end and it had the orgasmic refractory period. And I was like, this is weird. And then like it made a mess. I was like confused and what's going on? Like why does this feel different now? And and yeah, and then you know, my little stash of like stockings and pantyhose like grew. And then like I turned 16, and now, oh wow, I don't have to steal little scraps. I can go buy my own. And once I had that like freedom to like make my own money and go shop in the women's section of my own, I sort of like started it just all started like escalating from there. And I got away, and I got away with as much as I could. And then like sort of over time, I sort of like moved on to incorporating more elements of the feminine other than just like the pantyhose and stuff. And then from there, yeah, it just sort of snowballed in many different ways. And I guess now, I mean, we kind of mentioned this, that we were kind of bringing to the topic, but this distinction between like the different types, like sartorial versus anatomic, and blah blah blah. And um, I often um, like say people like, or people will like hear my story and sort of like not relate to it because I focus so much on like the clothing side of things. But like I feel like um these distinctions between like that strictly transvestic type and like like I like don't think there is such thing as like a pure transvestic type, honestly. I mean, if there is, it's like rare, but like I feel like the transvestic type is like the seed. It like has the potential to transform into every other type.
It's like the most accessible type that, like, people tend to do, because 'cause you're
Right.
not just gonna, like, on a whim be like, "Oh, let me get breast implants,"
Right.
It's
Right.
so but you might, like,
Right.
wear a bra.
So yeah, and it's also like you try on the clothes and you look in the mirror, and let's say you're really hairy, your sort of mind is gonna be like, "That's gross. I look bad. I need to get rid of all this body hair." So that like so now there's like an incongruity between like your desire, which is to wear pretty feminine clothes, and your appearance, which is like these pretty clothes are highlighting my body hair. Okay, so now you want to get rid of all your body hair. Is that now anatomic? Because last time I checked, body hair and it's part of your anatomy. It's part of
Right, or is it even behavioral because it's the act of shaving?
yeah, it's the act of shaving. The shaving rituals, like that can be a huge thing for people. And then, okay, so now you are interested in transvestism, and now, okay, well, what if you have really thick beard shadow and it's just like really hard to get a clean shave? Okay, so now you're going to be motivated to get laser hair removal in order to help your cross dressing. So now you have dysphoria about your beard because it interferes with your desire to wear feminine clothing. Or to take another extreme example, you really want to wear yoga pants. You're just like, you really, are envious of women who wear yoga pants. That's like that's like the primary desire is to wear the yoga pants. But you want to wear them in public. Okay, well, now you have to tuck. Okay, well, now maybe I want to chop off my penis because like I want to wear the yoga pants. So like, is that sartorial? Is it anatomic? What is it? I just feel like these
Yeah.
distinctions are arbitrary because they all feed into each other, and
Yeah,
they're all related. And like some people start off with the anatomic as like maybe that's the foundational one, and that can develop into every other thing. But I feel like every type has the potential to develop into every other type. Um,
right, I would say I agree that the division between these categories is not as clear as some people make them out to be, and that's part of why instead of calling them, like, autogynephilia subtypes, I've started just referring to them as, like, embodiment subtypes, because the point is to be, like, your target gender, and there's just various avenues, various pathways to embodying that, whether it's the clothing or the body or how you behave, and I agree that they're all of them are in service of trying to achieve a cross-gender aesthetic, and something you were saying reminded me of this quote of Hirschfeld's that I really like, where he said that the transvestic drive directs itself toward the whole costume to the very last detail,
right.
and
And
it's
yeah, and that those
yeah,
details are important because you can't achieve that detail unless you change your body often. Like if you have a very masculine face, your desire to be a pretty crossdresser might be interrupted by like now you desire facial feminization surgery. And like I think there's this, and this is very common in the trans community, where people like to do like the whole like true trans thing, or like I'm more trans because I hate myself more. I'm more real as a trans person because I hate my body with a burning passion. And like you only mildly hate your body, so you couldn't possibly understand what I go through. It's like it's
right,
sort of
that
like,
legitimation is through suffering.
you're right. It's like, my condition is a real, legitimate medical condition because I suffer the most extreme duress over my body than anyone else. I hate my body more than anyone else. Therefore, my thing is real. And if you just want, to look pretty, then like it's not the same thing. But I think the way I sort of conceptualize it is like, and I know this is not like technically accurate, but like I kind of like it because I feel like it sort of relates to it. But I think the core thing is like feminization. And like that is such a wide concept because that includes the clothing. It includes, you know, because what is feminization? It is the process of becoming feminine. Well, what is that? It just means approximating like all the things associated with females. Well, that's everything. That's like
Right,
literally everything. It's the
yeah, it's like
clothing, it's
sexiness
just the
rather than
body.
sex.
Yeah, it's like yeah, I've always liked how you define that in your book, like femininity and masculinity are just sexness. And
Yeah, I hope that
so
catches on. I feel as I've thought about it more, I realize like it has been a very useful construct in my own thinking to differentiate between sex and sexness, sexness just being gender.
right.
And I want a sex-based definition of gender that's simple, and it seems like it can ultimately be simplified down to that one term.
Yeah. Or just, make it more jargony. It's like uh symbolic signifiers associated or correlated with like sex. Um
Right, like sex-associated traits, but it's, like,
Yeah.
too many syllables. I'm like, in
Right.
terms of messaging, I'm always trying to figure out less
Right.
syllables, simpler words. It's gotta be mimetically viable.
Yeah. But I've had people say that, like, well, I can never detransition because, the only reason you were able to detransition was because you didn't have real dysphoria. You were just a cross-dresser who had, sartorial AGP, and like me, I truly hate my penis, so therefore I can never detransition or whatever. And it's like, I just think it's more complicated than this. Like,
That's
that's
also not
just
a contest that's worth winning. It's like, who's
exactly.
suffering
Yeah.
more? Like, who wants
Yeah.
to win that
Yeah.
contest?
Yeah, exactly. But I think people do want to win that because that is a pathway to legitimacy in society because you get sympathy, you get compassion. People, um, they like, wow, like you're suffering so much. That must be really hard. Like, like I'm gonna feel bad for you. Whereas if you're just like, oh yeah, this is just like fun and games, it makes me feel good, then it's like you're sort of like, okay, well, you're not doing this in response to deep suffering. You're just having fun. So like, I'm not going to take you seriously or something. Um, but yeah. And I've like described before that like I was more so pulled into my transition via the euphoria of like AGP versus being like pushed into it from my dysphoria.
Yeah, you were
Uh,
following bliss instead of fleeing suffering.
Yeah, and I think that was largely true, but I think people sort of take that and they just assume that like I've never had any struggles with like my body or something. And one of the ones, and this is why I think this distinction between like the sartorial and the anatomic is like um not a good one because like if you really want to wear women's clothing, you want to look good in women's clothing often. And women's clothing is like not constructed around like a bodybuilder masculine type. And like I was
Yeah,
a
don't
body
I know?
and like
Yeah.
I was a bodybuilder. I was really into lifting weights. I loved lifting weights and I still love lifting weights. I just love everything about it. But like having giant muscular arms sort of just like conflicts because a lot or like huge shoulders and stuff like like deltoids and traps like it's just women's clothing doesn't look as good on you, I think.
It at least
um
doesn't look as feminine, you
yeah,
know?
I mean this is all subjective in a way, but I'm
Right,
just
but
saying
no,
that like but
it's
like
hard.
the like actual clothing is like when they're designing it, they like design the proportions on the assumption of certain like statistical patterns of like body shape. And
Yeah,
so
tiny arms, narrow
yeah,
shoulders.
yeah. And so like I had always struggled with this like tug of war between do I embrace being a gym bro because I love lifting weights or do I, you know, do girly workouts like focusing on hip thrusts to make my butt bigger, because like women and men work out differently in the gym usually, not all women. Some women just go full blown like bodybuilder gym bro mode,
I
but
respect
most
those women, yeah.
yeah, I actually do find like CrossFit muscular chicks like kind of hot in a way, but I mean
Yeah.
um but, but yeah, on myself, like I couldn't see that. So I've always had the struggles like, do I focus on like not making my muscles bigger or do I focus on, um like shrinking myself? Do I get big as a man or do I shrink myself? Do I tone? Do you tone or do you bulk? And it's sort of like that classic dilemma. And like, that's not quite as like dramatic of like, oh, I hate my penis and therefore I want to cut it off and blah blah blah. But it's like I still had that body um issue, but it was focused around like my muscularity because it conflicted with like my desire to be as feminine as possible. So it's not strictly that just like, oh, I'm only interested in clothing. It's like I want to be feminine in all respects. Um, Even if like I don't have like a crippling dislike of like my penis, but again, because I'm more of like the agamp type, um, which was also important. Going back to my story, we're kind of jumping all over the place here, but like, um, yeah. So I don't know. It's just like these like distinctions between these different types. I just feel like they're they're like helpful as like a starting place, but I think when you dig into it, it's like very rare for people to have like strict like a
Right, like, usually
to be
people have
like
some
a
mixture of them.
right. And um yeah, so I don't know. I always feel like people sort of like it's like, oh yeah, like I'm glad your story works for you, but like they somehow think that like and again, this sort of like I know I'm being defensive here, which is like part of like this old like knee jerk habit of like from the trans my experience in the trans community. Like I need to like legitimize my transness or my detransness or my past transness. It's like weird how much like I still care about that in like a
Yeah.
weird
I mean, you
way.
took hormones for 8 years, like, you did the thing, you know?
Yeah, yeah,
I
and
don't think you have to defend it that much in terms of, like, the legitimacy. You have the
yeah,
orientation that leads to it, you did it for 8 years, including
yeah,
social transition, like, that you did it.
yeah. That is true, but I just think like people sort of yeah, I don't know. It's just this whole like dysphoria versus euphoria thing, and I think like yeah, I don't know. I just think like sort of the like anatomical subtype who have like strong anatomical dislike, and it's particularly there's something like that's been really seen as like the holy grail of like male to female transition for obvious symbolic reasons is like the penile inversion and like like having that be like the ultimate surgery or the final surgery or like the main surgery, the big milestone. It's like the big thing. And and when some random person asks, like, have you had the surgery? That's what they think of. Because
Right.
that's sort of like the defining thing. But I think like the
But
experiences
FFS is actually better in terms of people benefiting from it, as far as
I
I can tell.
I think laser hair removal and electrolysis is like even more important than
Well, right, that would be like I guess, usually people would do that before FFS anyways,
right.
but yeah.
Right. Yeah, and that goes. The other thing is like people always say like oh yeah, like I've been on hormones for 3 years. I passed. And it's like no, it's like your hair is longer. You got laser. You have slightly dewier skin. Maybe you take care of yourself. You're taking better pictures, better lighting. you like you care about your parents more. Like those are the things. You like shaped your eyebrows. Like those are the things that make way more difference than like these incredibly subtle shifts in subcutaneous fat and like lightening of like the thickness of like the skin like that like for most people HRT has a very minimal it basically like it gives you softer skin and you grow tits that's it and it makes you cry more but doesn't really make you pass more
Right, it helps yeah, like, it usually doesn't help too much. I think there's some people where they do actually have a big response to it, but I would say, like, typically, the other stuff you mentioned, basically the cross-dresser hacks of, like, plucking your eyebrows a certain way and getting electrolysis, those things seem more important.
right yeah and that was what was always interested in me I was always interested in like those little things that like that you can do because I got like really into like makeup and cosmetology and all these things and I'm sort of getting back into it again so like that's kind of like
Yeah,
another
I've noticed you've been
interesting thing
feminine, doing the feminizing a little more.
well that's been this whole big journey because my detransition process has been like trying to come up with ways to like yeah like how to live as a man who has a GP. And there's some people who just, you know, they just shut that side of themselves down and they just become masculine and like they can supposedly be happy like that. But um, I tried it to various strategies, trying to develop this like really positive conception of like traditional masculinity, trying to do like the conservative Christian route. I tried that for a while.
Yeah, I've
But then,
seen you've gone through several things in the last year of
oh
detransition.
my gosh, yeah, it's been
Mhm.
like it's like a roller coaster of like trying these different things um and you know part of it is just like I one of my main motivations for detransition was I had grown tired of kind of sticking out and like because I was never like 100% stealth. Usually I'm like clocky. I was just like tired of being clocky. I don't want it to be normal. I wanted to blend in and just be like a regular guy who like, not like not the person when you walk in the room, all the eyes look on them because they stand out because they're violating some social contract, basically. Um, I wanted to be the wallflower who doesn't have people look at me, doesn't have attention. Um, and that was great. I mean, there's I really like do enjoy that. And but I thought that like, but still, at the back of my mind, I'm like always still just like tempted because like I like never threw away all like my girl clothes or my women's clothing. So it's all like in the laundry and like I live with my wife and it's like, I'm doing like her laundry, like folding clothes or something. And it's just like, I'm just like, I don't know, it's just like the same temptations, the same desires, just like they were still there. So like it was just a matter of like, how can I like tried to like just like get into men's fashion for a while, which is fine, but like it just really didn't
It's
do
like
it
all
for
right,
me.
but it's not that rewarding, right?
Yeah, I mean, for some people, like, they can really get into it, and there is actually a lot of, like, men's fashion stuff that, like, you can get super nerdy about it, and, like but it's just, like, it didn't grab me erotically or it didn't have that same pull, which is basically it's, like, just connected to, like, my sexuality, which is and that's, like, the other thing is, like, I've sort of, during my detransition, I, like, gone through various back and forth about whether it is like healthy to indulge this and like kind of like I guess like a private masturbation session or something like this. And I would just try and like like repress it a little bit, but then I kind of like accepted it, just like this occasional thing. But like if I'm like cross dressing around the house, it brought back the same sort of dualities and fear and shame and stigma of like, okay, well, I'm cross-dressing around my house, which is great, but what if my neighbor rings the doorbell and it's an emergency and I need to like go outside because there's something crazy happening outside, and now I'm like cross-dressed, and my neighbors knew me as like Rachel as trans, so I'm sure they wouldn't think it's like that weird, but I
I don't
kind of
think
like
that would surprise them at all.
it probably wouldn't surprise them, but like I
No.
kind of I kind of developed this like new personas like, oh, I'm Ray, I'm a masculine guy. And so I liked that idea of presenting as a masculine guy, but it's sort of like just the social category of being a man who like dresses up in like women's clothing and like wears makeup and is very feminine. Like it just sort of like I don't know, like I just kind of grew up because I'm heterosexual or like or like gynesexual, like attracted to women. Like I just grew up like almost every other straight boy. I just grew up like with this fear of like being called gay. It's just like you don't want to be seen as like a gay guy, and and so yeah, there's this fear that like, oh, if I go out wearing short shorts and my nails are painted, I have makeup or whatever, I'm like wearing tight clothing or whatever, people are just gonna assume I'm like gay, and like that, you know, there's just for gynosexual males, that's just there's like so much deep stigma and shame around that. That's, you
Right,
know,
like, that male side of you would, like, be dissatisfied with having other people see you as gay.
right. Um,
Yeah.
so or just, you know, it's not just being perceived as gay, it's also like just I just sort of have this intuitive notion based on like all my experience in life that like people, and also based on like my own experiences too. Like I think there's something about a male being feminine that sort of just gives people an ick feeling. And I think this is not entirely socially constructed. I think it's mostly socially constructed, but I do think there's like a evolutionary psychology element in there
I think there's some evolutionary element to it too,
because
yeah.
um it it intersexual like mating dynamics and dating strategies revolve around the complementarity of the male and the female, which is like the masculine and the feminine in the natural state of like, you know, in like the evolutionary history, like it would probably be rare for if you are a male and you can grow a thick beard, you probably didn't like clean shave every day. You didn't do that. Males had their facial hair. They just let everything grow. They weren't like I mean I'm not talking about before we invented razors or whatever. Like
Right, yeah.
so there's just like this complementarity between like females and males, and I think that attraction to masculine men, I think is just like that is like the default of female sexuality. And as someone who is interested in dating women, I sort of just have this intuitive understanding that like most women find it kind of like disgusting in some way or another. They just sort of like have a
Mm.
reaction against it. Such and I just like
I think most are just indifferent.
I actually think um they might not tell you, but I think internally that's like the gut reaction. I'm not saying they're going to be rude about it or anything. I just think like that's like the gut reaction. It's like seeing a snake or a spider. It's like one of these like instinctual things. Like it's kind of hardwired. I just think there's something about that. And so Julia Serrano has this concept of called a femophobia, where there's something distinctive about males becoming feminized that triggers this like social like response that's like over the top relative to the opposite of like females being masculine. And so I think this is deep in human psychology. So like when males are feminine, I just think like which is different than like having a social category to understand feminine males. For example, like, oh, that's just a gay guy. You see some, flamboyant gay guy, and it's like, oh, you have a social script, but if you're not otherwise flamboyant in that way and you are super feminine in other dimensions, it sort of like creates this like incongruity that people don't know how to categorize. Um so in regards to like um me being more feminine lately, I've kind of came to the point where like I had to do what I did when I first started this like 9 years ago when I started embracing all this. Like I just had to kind of just say like fuck it. I mean like I just have to
Yeah.
not care if my neighbors think I'm weird or and it goes even further than that. It's like you like have to accept that like not just that people will think you're weird, but they might think you're like perverted in some. It's like I just have to accept that. And so it's part of like just embracing that like this is my sexuality and like my sexuality is weird and it's just like that's okay. And like yeah,
But it's
there's
also, like, not that weird in the scheme of things because it's still, like, a type of heterosexuality, but
yeah, I mean it's
yeah,
I
I
just
get that
mean
it's different.
it's just weird like statistically speaking. Like it's just
Right.
it's just abnormal like relative to the average male. Um
Right, but
and
you, like, can't control how people see you, basically, so
Yeah,
you're
but
just, like, accepting
most
that now?
most people, yeah, but most people deeply care about how they're perceived by others. So it's like very hard to train yourself to not feel those feelings, but I did it for 8 years. That's the other thing. But the difference now is that I'm not trying to pass as female, such that like if someone, clocked me, recognized I'm male, I'm not gonna be like, oh, that makes my feelings hurt or whatever. Or the other thing, like being detransitioned now, it's like, you know, I have to get my face looking like this, I have to shave. Relatively, I have to shave in the morning. But it's like if tomorrow morning for work I don't feel like shaving, then like I can go into work and have shadow on my face and not feel like there's this conflict in like my presentation and the social category I'm fitting into. Because when I was trans identified, like I recognize myself as like non-binary trans feminine, but the social script for everyone else is like, oh, you're just a trans woman, you're just a regular trans woman. And in that social script, trans women do not have facial hair.
Right,
Or
there's
it,
some expectations.
yeah, there's an expectation that I have to present in a feminine way all the time. And so now and I grew to really resent that idea that in order to present myself to the public, I now need to literally shave every single time I do anything. So like I need to go up to the gas station. Oh, I better shave. Like, oh, I need to go to work. I better shave. Whereas now it's like I have the option to shave because I like it because it makes me prettier. But if I have a little bit of 5 o'clock shadow, I can still go to the grocery store because I'm not trying to pass as female. So that's been like the huge difference for me this time around. Because I feel like I'm kind of like it's like deja vu all over again in terms of like my kind of coming out as like a feminine guy or whatever, whatever. But it's like I don't have this narrative of like I'm a trans woman and I have to fit into this box of what trans women are supposed to be like. Otherwise, people will think. But I'm sure a lot of people probably do think I'm like, oh, that's like a baby trans or something. Or I'm just like, or I'm trying to pass. Because I have like gynecomastia now. And I don't like try and like suppress that or like bind or anything because I don't like doing that. So
No, that'd be a bad idea.
yeah, or like like wear a sports bra or like a not like a full binder, but like there's like these sporty sort of like compression shirts that men wear at the gym and stuff, or like these like Under Armour compression shirts and stuff. So like well, when I first detransitioned, I was like wearing stuff like that because I was like really self conscious about having like man boobs, but like
Right. It sounds like you're learning how to not give a fuck.
yeah, which was the what I needed to do when I first transitioned was like, because I didn't pass. So I was like, well, I want to do all this. I don't want to like stay in my house all day. I want to incorporate this. And yeah, and just learning not to give a fuck. And part of it, the struggle recently is now that I'm like this YouTube person and on Twitter, sort of interacting with like the gender criticals and like I myself, you know, aligned with gender critical thought or it's criticism of like the broader transgender ideology movement and stuff. you know like most of the people in that space just have like deeply negative attitudes about AGPs, and since I'm open about AGP, you know what obviously what I'm talking about, like
Yeah,
the blue dress thing. So
yeah,
just
yeah.
like so I think there's partly because of that public persona that I've developed over the last years, like a detransitioner, I just sort of like didn't want to, or there's like some reluctance to like embrace being super feminine because I just knew that there's like a certain subset of my audience on YouTube that's going to inevitably comment, "You're a pervert." So it's like I had to like learn to accept that there just are going to be people who
Yeah.
their only conception of me is I'm just like I'm just this like messed up pervert. And so I just had to like embrace that and be like, well, partly, like it's like perversion is bad when it hurts other people, but like I do have some pretty kinky fantasies, like so in some sense, like it is just true that yeah, I have um I do have a lot of kinky stuff related to feminizing. So it's like, in that sense, I kind of just like embrace it. It's like they think I'm like a pervert. Well, maybe that's okay. It's like,
Yeah, it's like,
yeah,
so what?
there's like other redeeming aspects of my personality, I believe, besides that. And it's like,
Right,
yeah, and there's just gonna be people who just like demonize it because, that's, and, maybe they have good reasons to do that because, they're just like tired of all these AGPs, taking up space in female, places.
right. I think a lot of the feminists, the gender critical feminists, they come at it from a place of hating men,
Yeah,
um,
I think that's true. I think that's
and male sexuality, they hate that too, and so
well, I mean, look at like I think it was it Andrea Dworkin, her book. I think it was her.
intercourse.
Yeah, just like I mean,
Yeah, I
it's
read
not
that
it's,
a while
it,
ago.
it's not just the perverted AGPs that are terrible people because of their sexuality. Just like being a heterosexual man is just like having a penis is just for some hardcore feminists that just like you're just like a bad person because of that. And like everything that's wrong in the world is because of men. Um,
Right, and they'll always choose the bear, you know?
yep. Yep. And yeah, so it's like, and part of my detransition process, as far as like, you know, connecting with like reconnecting with like my male identity, I actually have started um, I've sort of like gotten in touch with like m- male communities, at least on like the internet, of these sort of like I guess they'd be called like red pill men or whatever. They're sort of like these men who take like this more evolutionary psychology approach, or sort of like have like a positive conception of like men that's like not developed by like the sort of like nice guy feminist ally worldview that like I think most AGPs develop, because like I sort of think I don't have like any statistics or data on this, so maybe I'm making this up, but I kind of feel like it's largely true that most AGPs probably like didn't have like really super strong experiences with male socialization growing up, and they always related better with women, and they sort of like always saw themselves as like feminist allies. They wanted to be strong feminist allies. They sort of like just take that very like female centric perspective, and they just sort of like like apologize for like the patriarchy all the time. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry, I'm a man. I really internalized that for so many years. And
Yeah, a lot of AGPs do.
yeah, and like part of my detransition process is like learning to accept that there's nothing wrong with being a man, and that while there are definitely historical patterns of like exploitation, discrimination, like men have definitely done messed up things, but I have sort of learned to reject that like overarching theoretical framework of like patriarchy as being like you know the classic like fuck the patriarchy is like your explanation for like why everything sucks. Like I just sort of like have this newfound appreciation for men that I never used to have. Like I was always like men are stupid, men are gross, men are toxic, masculinity is toxic. But now it's like I look at like those construction workers, or like the guys working in the sewer, like, on the
They
roof,
literally build civilization.
Yeah, so it's like now I have this like deep appreciation for those men. And like while I still probably wouldn't want to hang out with those macho blue collar guys because I'm like like a intellectual type person who just is, you know, I can't talk about sports and whatever very much. I'm not a sports person. So it's like I can't, but I like and like conceptually, I like it's so much more deeply empathetic to like my male species, like my fellow brethren, that like I just, and that's been like a huge part of like my conception, and that's even influential to my newfound acceptance of like my sexuality, and embracing, which is ironic because it's like thing like it's like not that it's like a feminine thing to do to embrace your sexuality as an AGP, but I actually think it's very masculine because it's putting your needs as a man first. It's saying like, whereas I think the default assumption is that you're like putting the needs of like the women in your life first or something. Whereas I think like the more like the like more like the like anti nice guy thing to do is to state your own needs and like focus on yourself. Like that is the more masculine thing to do is to focus on your own needs. Um, because women are attracted to men who own their own shit and like do their own thing and like their frame of reference is like their selves rather than everyone else. And I think like when you embrace your AGP, you're sort of like making yourself your own frame of reference rather than making your frame of reference like the rest of society or your everyone else. So it's like so in a weird sort of ironic twist, like embracing my positive male conception has allowed me to realize that like it is my right as a man to like center myself and to get my sexual needs met. So like it's just my sexual needs are not being this like masculine macho dominant guy. It's like the opposite of that. But still in the same way, I'm like kind of centering my own desires in like a way. Which is so it's kind of like a weird like irony in a way. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what matters is that you're, getting better at, worrying less about social judgment and just doing what you want to do, like, unapologetically,
Right.
because like,
Yeah.
you still have, like, restraint in terms of, um, not doing, say, some of the things that you might have critiqued, transsexuals for doing in terms of, say, like, women's spaces or, the various stuff. Like, the
Right.
way you're living your life now, you're living in the male world.
Right. So yeah, like it doesn't matter, how much I passed or whatever, like if I really tried to, go full out or whatever, like I actually tried to super pass as female, I would still not use the women's restroom, even if like I would like walk into the men's bathroom and the man might have like a double take or even like, are you sure you're in the right place? Like, I was just like, "Yes, I am in the right place." Like, and, like, that and then sort of getting over that fear that you're gonna get, like, beat up and stuff, like, w w which is, like, a real fear, like, like, femme men, like, do get attacked um, by other men all the time, so it's like,
Yeah. I don't think
um
it happens as much as, trans activists might say
right.
it does, though.
Yeah, yeah, I definitely think, like, it's very rare. But the fact that it's, like, possible kinda, like, makes you feel less safe, which is, like, the big motivator for this whole, like, "Oh, trans women aren't safe using the men's room, blah, blah, blah," and it's like, and I know there's, like, a lot of complicated, like, practical things, like, okay, well, what if you're, like, a transsexual man, who has a full beard on testosterone, sort of and so you get into the bathroom politic debates that are, like, almost, like, like, tractable, just given the reality that there are, like, highly pathable stealth transsexuals out there. So it's like,
Yeah, the iron law of
whatever.
passing always wins. If you pass, and you can go
Right.
where you want.
Um, so, yeah, whereas, like, now I'm trying to, like, make my little small difference in the world is just to, like, increase the destigmatization of like feminine males using male spaces without fear of you know yeah, because I think that like the more that can happen then um yeah, and like I've heard I was listening to Skylar on Benjamin Boyce's
Yeah, her
channel, like
interview was really good.
yeah, it was good, but it's also funny because she was like talking about like using the bathrooms, and she was like, yeah, like um I only started using the women's room and when I started having like serious problems using the men's room. And she's like, oh yeah, let me give you this like clear example of like what that was. And like her example of like a problem that she had is like literally the man just looked at her and said like, are you sure you're in the right room? He didn't beat her up, he didn't threaten her, he didn't get mad at her, he just said, are you in the right room? So like, I guess that's technically like a problem because you're like
Right.
making you're like thinning out. But what if she had said, I am in the right room? Like, would that have been a problem that necessitates out of like practical sheer safety and necessity? Okay, well, I now need to go use this other restroom. It's like I don't think that immediately follows. And so I think some of these ideas of
I would say for most transsexuals, like, yeah, like having a guy give you a double take is not necessarily a reason to stop using the men's room. But for her in particular, she does pass particularly well.
that
I
is
don't know
true.
how well she did back then, but like she literally used the women's bathroom at the Gen Spec conference, and the TERFs did not know this. Like she
Right.
legitimately passed.
Right. So I'm not like trying to like, say like misalign impugn like her motives or anything, or say she's a bad person or that she didn't make like the right choice or whatever. I'm just saying that like if that is like your big example of like problems using the male bathroom as like a feminine male, like it's just the fact that someone did a double take, like that's not actually a problem. Like, it might seem psychologically, but I think it's just like looking for a reason to use a women's room because you want to do that. And you're just waiting until you mail failed enough and like and you use the double take as like a gauge to determine your passability. But like this idea that that's like a pragmatic challenge in your life that you need to like respond to. I'm now I want to generalize not just like her specific case, but just like
Right.
because like yeah, she's maybe like
'Cause she seems particularly, like, reasonable about the whole
yeah,
thing, like,
and
she's thoughtful about it.
she's like an exception as far as like she like really passes well, like to the point where if she was like questioned in the women's room, like her voice is passable and she wouldn't get clocked. Whereas like most AGPs, even if they sort of like can blend in on like a surface level, if they get asked a question in the bathroom, their voice will give them away like 99% of the time, which can cause a problem. Particularly if you buy into gender critical, you know, uh, concepts about the sanctity of or the importance of these single sex spaces. So it's like for all the other HPs who don't pass, it's like you know, like how much of this like problem with the male bathroom is like all in our heads, or it just comes out of like the AGP psychopathology itself, like you were talking about before, just like won't like you sort of don't want to use the men's room because that's an
It
acknowledgement
reminds you every
of
time.
yeah, it reminds you
Yeah.
of like who you are, and like people don't want to do that because they're running away from their from like why do like we wouldn't have this concept in the trans community of like the dead name unless there was this like deep psychological process of like running away from your past, running away from who you were. So yeah, that's probably like the main driver for the bathroom. It's just like it just sort of doesn't align with their sense of themselves or their or their new story that they're being told. But
Right.
also, I think partly this is like it's like a script. Like the script is like transition there's like there's like a script for it. It's like there's certain little milestones on your journey, and like you all sort of know that like eventually your goal is to like use all these women's spaces, sort of like just like an assumption. um and yeah, I don't know, it's like is this like due to like a deep need, like like how many transsexuals or trans women like truly need to um like do that psychologically in order to live like a happy life, or is it just sort of like that's the social narrative that they've internalized as part of their autobiographical identity, and it just becomes like this
I think
interwoven
they just
narrative.
I think they wanna minimize any reminders of their sex in everyday life, so they're gonna coalesce around whatever makes that happen with regards to policy.
Yeah, but that it in a weird way, it doesn't really make sense because why are so many of them like so open about? I mean, they're wearing like trans pride flags, and so they like don't do voice training. And it's like, and I think that's actually the good thing is I philosophically like don't like the concept of like voice training. But nevertheless, it's sort of
It's
like
also hard.
yeah, it's also incredibly hard. I think most people who have passable voices are it's a genetic gift, or
Or they just work so hard at it.
yeah, or that yeah they have like a specific talent at it's like a voice actor who can like manipulate very fine detail, or if you're like a talent for singing, you can like manipulate your voice in all these different ways.
Yeah. Like
Most
Ziana
people,
of Trans Voice Lessons, she's amazing at, like, making a female voice.
yeah, most people don't have that ability. um, but anyway, like I just feel like in so many dimensions, these AGPs are totally fine with people. I mean, I'm not totally fine. I think that's maybe like exaggeration, but like they sort of like get to a plateau of like reasonable enough like passability, but they usually get to the point where like they just transition far enough such that everyone knows the social script that they're in. It's like, oh, I see you. I can tell that you're a trans woman. That's going to trigger these social scripts. Like, okay, well, I'm going to use she her pronouns for you. I'm going to assume. Whereas like 30, 40 years ago, like that social script for what to do in polite social situations at like the coffee shop or the bar or whatever. I was like, now it's like most people like unless they're of the more explicitly conservative, gender critical position who have like strong opinions on like sex based pronouns, or they just like getting in higher out of triggering the libs or whatever. But like I think for most people, it's just like the recognition that oh, that is a trans woman. Now I need to play this polite social language game that we've developed as a society, that like you have to like use the she her pronouns, you have to like blah blah blah. And it's like I think like a lot of trans women just want to get to that point where they're perceived to be trans women
Well,
in
I
order.
think they want more, but, like, that's what's actually attainable.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's true, but it's also like if you're fine.
Like, how have you been in men's bathrooms since detransitioning? Have you had any trouble?
No, I mean, I also haven't really gone out super feminine that much. That's only been like very recent where I sort of like wore women's clothing, and so some of my old clothes I like wore them to like the grocery store recently, wearing like makeup like this, and then it's sort of like an interesting experience. But I haven't like used the bathroom yet, like being incredibly super, wearing really feminine stuff. But
Yeah,
because
I
yeah,
haven't had any troubles with it personally. But, I mean, to be fair, I am 6'4" and my shoulders are very strong looking, so it's like, even if a guy sees me as some sort of queer and doesn't like that, they still have that evolutionary instinct not to mess with the big chimp, you know?
right. And also you're in Portland, right? So that's pretty.
Very true, yeah.
That's probably a
But
big
but I
difference.
I think the sort of, like, progressive urban monoculture has percolated so far, in basically any area that has highly educated people. where even if you're not necessarily in a super lib city, if you're just in a city, it's probably pretty safe.
Yeah, and like most people's instinct is to grease the social wheels of acceptability, such that they don't like to cause commotions and scenes. And so like
Yeah.
they and this is how people this like phenomenon of like sort of like not gendering trans women. Like I I used to experience this all the time. Like I would be in the line for like a store, coffee shop or something, and it's like the person at the cash register would use honorifics for literally everyone. You know, thank you, sir, thank you, ma'am, blah blah blah. Then they get to me and they don't use anything. So it's like,
Uh-huh.
so
You
it's
get
like,
dayed basically.
yeah, and so it's like, you know, they recognize that I'm not a regular guy. I'm also not a woman. I'm like this thing, this trans thing. And so it activates like this cue, but like they don't want to, they like know they have to modify their script in order to not cause a scene or whatever. I think it's not just wanting to like not trigger like a GameStop ma'am situation, but it's also like they just themselves don't like causing like pain for other people, or they just like will keep their opinions to themselves. It's like if they think, oh wow, that's like a man in a dress, they're just not going to tell you that to your face. They just might think it, you know.
No, but,
Um,
like, yeah, I think that's yeah, that's how it is. Um, uh, yeah, I think most trans people exist in that no that sort of, like, uncanny middle space.
right. And this is why I think like the trans narrative can be. I don't think it's purely neutral psychologically. I think it can actually it's like not that like we have like the like standard ideological approach is that we have these gender identities. So a trans woman has the gender identity of woman, and their identity is not trans. Trans is just an adjective that describes their life history, but it's not actually like an intrinsic like part of themselves. They sort of use it as like an adjective. It's like, oh, I'm just like, you know, tall women, blonde women, black women, white
Right, I
women,
know. That's
trans women, cis women. So it's like it's not part of their identity. But I think,
it's a linguistic trick.
yeah, but I think like the trans identity itself, though, and in terms of the autobiographical narratives that surround it, I do think once you take on the trans identity, you sort of say like, yes, the concept of trans woman, that category best like explains my life. When you internalize that as your autobiographical narrative identity, that can that can create brand new psychological problems that never existed prior to that moment when you decided to adopt that trans identity. So I'm not talking about like the, you know, more foundational gender dysphoria stuff, but like the moment when you consciously decide to take on that label of trans, apply it to yourself, and now you have this new understanding of yourself that I am a trans woman, like that causes psychological problems because you now have this
It's the
I
expectations.
yeah, and it's like I just did a video about this the other day where um
Oh, your recent video was great on the the one that has a bajillion comments and stuff
the like
that Sasha retweeted.
the like the
I'm thi
psychology of trans women.
no, I'm thinking about I mean, I guess it wasn't
Oh,
necessarily on
yeah.
this
Oh,
topic, but
yeah.
that
Oh,
one
yeah.
where you're just like,
Oh, yeah.
"Yeah, I'm
I'm
AGP."
oh, yeah, embracing it, yeah.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm trying to, like, articulate this, like, problem with, like, this sort of in between space that trans women live in because they sort of are resentful of the fact that everyone sees them as trans and not as real women. So it's like all their cis women friends, you know, cis women. I know people don't like that term, but um,
They'll have
like
to deal with it.
yeah, it's like can be useful sometimes, but um, like they don't see them as real women, but they kind of like play along. They invite them into things. They use she her pronouns. They like don't dead name them. They like they do all the things you're supposed to do as a polite, politically correct, good liberal progressive who's like a trans ally. But a lot of these trans women are resentful of the fact that they kind of can intuit that the cis women don't see them the same as the females. And so I think, a-
I think
a-
this still comes back to the psychopathology of autogynephilic gender dysphoria that, like, they just don't like not being seen as female.
well, I think it comes back to that. But what I'm trying to, like a lot of my channel is trying to propose a counterfactual, such that you know, would it have been possible to deal with this in a different way than the way most AGPs have done it? Like, if you had been introduced to autogynephilia and understood yourself not through this lens of I'm a trans woman and have a gender identity that makes me metaphysically identical in my gender status as a female. I just happen to have this arbitrary private medical condition that makes me born in the wrong body. But like in my mind, for all the things that count, I'm a real woman. If that narrative did not exist in our society, what is the counterfactual for healthier psychological narratives? And I don't buy this idea that the narrative processes, these autobiographical stories, are completely just a direct causative result of the underlying mechanistic psychopathology. It's like I think there's a cultural construction at play here that I think, and the existence of detransitioners proves that through a change of your autobiographical narrative identity, you can completely reconceptualize your relationship to all this stuff. And that's sort of my contention. I don't have evidence for it. I just have like my own anecdotal evidence and like some anecdotal evidence from other detransitioners, but I do think it's possible. So that's sort of like my contention is, I can't like prove it, but I just sort of like want to like develop that as a new possibility model, as a counterfactual that people ought to consider. And
Yeah, I think we have, uh, the self-aware AGPs, we have, like, a really interesting opportunity here where it's you're sort of talking about earlier about how, it's not like, after detransitioning, it's hard to find a niche, like, a way of being that sort of fits into societal scripts as, like, a feminine male, and I think we have a really good opportunity here to sort of experiment and find other ways um, that differ from, like, what the trans movement necessarily, um, does in terms of what transsexuals sort of lean toward. I yeah, I think there's a lot of potential here where if you can be accept that you're a man and also wanna dress feminine, and then also have a manly attitude of not giving a fuck, it's kind of a you can kinda still do what you want while in a pretty liberated fashion.
right. Yeah, I definitely think that is a new script that's opening up, like a new social script to understand this, to sort of like a new autobiographical identity model. The problem with self-aware AGP and having that being like your sort of primary self-conception, your primary auto, auto, autobiographical narrative to construct your identity, um, is it forces you to talk about your sexuality in public, and people don't like doing that. Um, I think, and I've seen a lot of self-aware AGPs. Um, and particularly the like transition ones, they like recognize the truth of the theory. They see themselves in the archetype, but it's not like central to understanding themselves. It's like not the story they tell in regards to like their underlying motivations. They just acknowledge it as like a part of their life story, but all this other stuff, the more traditional, trans stuff, like centering around like um, dysphoria and suffering and like expression of one's true self, and just sort of like this is just it sort of just gets reduced down to like expression of one's desires, and you sort of don't go into like, well, what are those desires? Like, why do you want to do this? But I feel like with the software AGP, like what I had to do, like in the recent video, it's like, you have to sort of say that like I'm doing all this because of my sexuality, and people just don't like doing that. They just like, I just think it's just like, because you can't go into work and talk about that in the same way that you can go into work and
Well,
talk about your true, self as like as a woman or whatever. Like, um,
yeah, but I think there's, depending on the environment, there's different allowed levels of specificity, you know? Like, at work, you obviously wouldn't get real granular about it. You
right,
know, you could say, like, "Yeah, I part of my attraction to women includes liking looking like one," you know, and, without, like, which
yeah,
ultim
that
you know?
that makes sense. That's actually, I didn't really thought about it that much. I guess, yeah, I don't know, but it's also like, I know you have made this analogy all the time between like, other minority sexualities, like homosexuality and stuff, and sort of like you can talk about homosexuality at work. You can talk about, it's like, oh, I have a husband, or you don't talk about like graphic things at work, but it's like, you talk about being heterosexual, you talk about being homosexual. So it's like we have like that, and it's like, so a homosexual in like a modern corporate environment, it's like diverse and stuff, like they don't have to hide that they have that sexuality. So I guess, but that's the sort of thing, is like the vast majority of people have not read your book. They don't understand all this like sexology stuff. They don't understand. They just think like, so I think that's going to be the hard part, is like developing a script or a narrative that connects it to a sexuality, but also like is like socially palatable to like have as like your central as like a central part of like your autobiographical
Like, in terms of your sexual
identity.
identity?
Yeah, yeah.
I think Anne Lawrence's approach of talking about it in terms of becoming what we love, or you could even just say being what we love, um, since it uses the construct of love, people don't really have like ick responses to that, and it's
Right. But I think one thing that's tricky here is that a lot of AGPs, they have this sort of like lovey stuff, that's like at the more like emotional level or whatever. But I think there's also this phase or this history of like, of it being like pretty, not in every case, but like it can be pretty explicitly paraphilic, and like, an actual like true kink sense, not like,
particularly in teenage years.
yeah, and it's not just like, oh, it's like I'm like in love or something. It's like, no, it's like it's very kinky, very deviant, and it's sort of like depraved in some sense or another. And yeah, I think that's sort of like that is the challenge, particularly when the people who have that side of themselves, that is on the more depraved end of the AGP spectrum, that gets brought into public, and then broadcast, on viral social media about, like these sissies or whatever who are doing public exhibitionism, or it's sort of like, you know there's sort of this conception in our culture. So I think that's the trick, is like trying to normalize AGP as a sexuality, while also not shoving under the rug the darker side of the sexuality, which is absolutely the case, which is what all the gender criticals focus on, is like that dark side of it, which definitely exists. And
Yeah, I mean, there's a few that don't necessarily behave well because of it. But I think overall most AGPs behave acceptably, and
well, it's like they behave acceptably in social situations, but I think in the bedroom in particular, and in their, pornography watching habits, or their masturbation sessions, or whatever, like when you really get into the nitty-gritty of like what they do in their private life to turn them on, and it's like, yeah, like ultimately we can, be liberal minded, sex positive, kinky, kink positive people, but there's a strong contingent of the population who are just sexually conservative. I mean, like, there's a large swath of the American public who doesn't accept homosexuality as being a valid thing, and has discussed response to that. So, like, so we can talk about how, like, homosexuality has become like more mainstream, but at the same time, like, there's a large, just look at the libs of TikTok Twitter account. It's like constantly showing, trying to paint the homosexual community in a bad light as being a bunch of sex craved deviants. So it's like, um like, it's not easy to make a minority sexuality just be 100% free of all stigma and all. And I think part of it is you have to, like, just like accept the stigma, or sort of that's sort of like my own approach, is that, like, um I have to not be afraid of being labeled as like sexually deviant. And that was like the big fear. um
right, and you have been labeled as such by some of the gender criticals, right? And just because they do that with all the AGPs, and like you've gotten through that, right? Like in the sense that like does it still bother you?
no, not really. I mean, because they just don't know me. Like,
Right, exactly.
they
Like
just like
they attack like these caricatures of the AGP,
right.
whereas there's a huge amount of diversity in how we um within the AGP population of how we express it, just the type of people we are in terms of our personalities. It's there's just so much variation, and so when people do hate on
Right.
AGPs as a group, I maybe it's just that I understand the group too well and just how varied they are, but it seems like they're attacking, a caricature rather than, like, the actual, like, median example of someone that's autogynephilic. Because I would say for most of them, it's something that doesn't even necessarily get that much external expression and might just be incorporated into their private sex life, um, or just sort of minor private gender issues they struggle with, but it's yeah, I don't think it's, yeah, I don't think it's as, like I think it's more prevalent than it actually looks like, and that most AGPs are pretty well behaved, and it's just that the inability like, we haven't had a public like, a group identity built by ourselves, at least, like, we've had the gender criticals have certainly tried to construct one for us, but we haven't built one for ourselves and been able to show people that actually we're not generally that harmful. And I think a lot of times it's AGPs are getting like charged with crimes committed by conventional heterosexuality, that it's people's like mistrust of like allogynephilia is sort of being put onto autogynephilia, and people are just like venting about that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I also just, maybe I spend too much time on GC Twitter reading.
No, I think you do, like, they're really not a representative sample
um,
of,
yeah,
like,
but
the normal
but
population.
the mere fact that you know e- even if it is a caricature, that caricature is influential on people's conceptions. And so this is like, I think, the biggest thing. Um, and it's one thing to, yeah, like, I don't know, there's sort of, I go back and forth about this. It's like, yeah, it is like a sexuality, like a sexual orientation, that more like basic way that's like analogous to these other minority ones like homosexuality or whatever. But it's also like, I don't think it's that far off base to describe it, or like it has these paraphilic dimensions. And like maybe I'm just projecting like my own case because I have a strong paraphilic dimension to this. Um,
Well, I mean, it literally is a paraphilia, so I'm not
right.
sure what you mean.
Well, I just mean that like I'm struggling to articulate this, but I feel like the obstacle to making autogynephilia part of your core autobiographical narrative, as opposed to just acknowledging that you roughly fit into the thing or like loosely describes, but ultimately you spend a lot of time when you're talking about your trans story or your gender journey, you sort of minimize the sexuality and you emphasize things like authenticity or whatever. um I think that minimization process, I think, is just going to prevent people from like, it's going to prevent the self-aware AGP community from growing just because like I think it's just, yeah, I don't know, it's just like hard to come to terms with that in a way because it's just so stigmatized.
Yeah, I guess it really depends on the individual. Like, I personally I had some issues coming to terms with it when I first learned about autogynephilia, but it just took me, like, a few months, and I didn't I accepted it, after a few months, and I came out to plenty of people, and it was, like, a non-issue. So for me, it's actually been pretty easy overall, and maybe it's just depends on all the different individual factors with our psychology and life experience, so it'll be easier for some and harder for others.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think this vary from person to person, but I just feel like for me it's been key to accept that this is like my sexuality, not just in this like broader romantic orientation stuff, but it's actually like it's the part, it's the thing that like all my erotic things that get me going the most are all connected to this. It's not like incidental. So like to embrace that,
Yeah,
and
it's,
like
like, central.
and like not having people fear that they're going to discover the paraphilic side of me, and not just like because what if like I'm not just AGP, but like actually have like a sissy kink that finds all that stuff, it's like erotic. People want to talk about self-aware AGP in terms of this like kind of sanitized sexual orientation language, which is very neutral, very judgment free. But I think people are reluctant for good reasons because it's stigmatized and there's shame around it, and it's like it's not easy to talk about, but it's like they don't talk about how they have sort of fetishized the AGP itself. So it's just like it's like not just like I'm trying to I'm really struggling with like my language here to try to like articulate this idea I have, but sort of like even for transition trans women who are not self-aware AGP, they can still like they might have started with like watching sissy porn, and then like that kind of motivated them to like come to terms with their transness, and then they kind of transition. But like even after they transition, that sissification kink can still be part of their sexuality, such that that is the porn that they watch in private. That is what gets them off. That is their secret private life, and they don't talk about it because it's stigmatized to talk about your kinks in public. But I think like that is like the thing that is like the hardest to talk about is the fact that it this stuff does connect to these more explicitly kinky stuff. Like,
Well, right, but, like,
um,
regular heterosexuality can have pretty kinky
yeah,
expressions too,
absolutely. And
and
kink
it's
and
about the
BDSM
context.
are highly stigmatized and taboo in our society. So that's what I'm saying. That's like that's the key. Like, this is why you don't talk about sex at the dinner table. You don't talk about it at work. It's because you don't talk about your kink. This is why, like, you go on FetLife and there's people, who don't show their face because they don't like want to get caught knowing, like, knowing that they're kinksters or like fetishists or whatever. So this is what I'm saying is that like until we acknowledge that like and I don't think it's not saying, and I'm not saying that like all AGPs are connected to this kinky stuff in that like explicit way, but I think it is, in my experience, it is a huge aspect of the AGP community that is not talked about. Because if you go onto the not safe for work side of Reddit, that's all about femboys and sissies and trans porn and all this stuff. That side of Reddit is bigger than the
It's
safe for
so
work
much bigger.
trans. So like
Yeah,
this
it's
is
so huge.
a
Yeah.
it's there's hundreds of thousands of people subscribed to like sissy, millions of people subscribed to sissy subreddits. There's more people into sissy kink than there are trans women identify talking in like the trans subreddit. So it's like this is a huge part of it, but people don't want to talk about this. And even I think within the self-aware AGP community, it's swept under the rug because they want, just like every other, you know, minority, they want to sanitize the worst
Yeah.
parts of the minority community, and they want to present a good public face because it's like a PR campaign. You gotta,
Yeah.
like, and
Well,
and,
I don't
and
know
that
why
makes.
you
Oh, go
like,
ahead.
why would you expect anything else? Like, the homosexuals did this too. If you read some of, like, Hirschfeld's earlier writings about homosexuality, he talks about their, like, loving embrace of each other, like, that just it's so, like, wholesome and chaste the way it's described, whereas if, now that homosexuality is more accepted, some people understand more, especially, like, with male homosexuality, how, like, debaucherous it can get, you know?
Yeah. Yeah, you
And
just you
so
just gotta go and grinder and, like, it's
I I don't really yeah, I think that's just a part of if you're normalizing something or at least, like, trying to destigmatize it and make it understood to a wider audience, that's just an inevitable part of doing that, and like I said, the homosexuals have already done that, and they showed that it works, and so I don't see an
right.
issue with doing that for us.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think you're ultimately right, and I do think that I do see that happening, and that is, like, the pathway, but I just think, um, like, maybe it's, like, just part of, like, my own, like, process of self-acceptance of, like it's like I can't just, like, acknowledge the, like, more sanitized side of this as my sexuality. Like, I think in order to be truly myself, like I have to acknowledge that there's like a kinkier side to this too. Because like if I want to enact that kinky side, then, unless I want to be one of these like down low people who's like always worried that they're gonna get like caught, on FetLife or whatever, it's like, like you have to sort of like lose the fear of even that. And like I think it's hard because like it's just,
Yeah, no,
like
it's definitely a
like
process. Like it's
yeah,
not easy, and you coming out and making YouTubes talking about it is definitely more brave than what most people have done. So, like you've put yourself out there much more and made yourself more open to attack. And so, um, yeah, I understand the sort of I don't know, the desire to also still be authentic though, and be
right,
like, yeah, there's some really like overtly sexual parts of this.
right.
Um,
Yeah. I mean, this is like a basic function of like the ego psychologically is to construct a socially acceptable mask to society. And that's like most of what defense mechanisms are, is just like how to, and it's like, like the like super ego takes in these like, social lessons of morality and the like normativity and like as all this, classic Freudian stuff, but it's like, that like ego defense is primarily involved in like making your mask, your like persona to like the rest of the world like look good. So I think it's
yeah,
like, and I think that with the with AGP leads to a lot of yeah, just like what would be called confabulation, or like sort of like we all have this like autobiographical narratizing function as part of like our basic, self concept of what like builds up the human mind in terms of, our reflective self consciousness is baked out of these narratives and metaphors and identities and stories we tell ourselves. And like the ego constructs that in a way that is like we all want to have a good story. Like when we meet with someone, it's like, oh, tell me about yourself. That answer that we give to tell me about yourself is so core to who we are, but we do that in a way that is like acceptable. It's
yeah,
very rare for people um, to reveal the sides of themselves that make themselves look bad to others. So it's like just like hard to do that. So yeah, I think that's going to be like the struggle with the self-aware AGP movement is like to get people to break down this like shame and stigma around acknowledging that there's like sexual stuff going on here, because it's just like I think it's very easy to not even be consciously aware that you're doing it. I don't think most of this is conscious at all. It's all happening at the unconscious level, but like you tell lies to yourself through these autobiographical
yeah,
narratives.
like the socially appropriate response bias, where
Right.
you just want to present yourself in a positive light that other people find acceptable.
Right.
And
And then
yeah,
you tell yourself that story long enough that you come to believe it. And so yeah, which is, why most AGPs like just yeah,
I
they
think that's why
just yeah.
it's important for us to come up with ways of talking about it that are socially acceptable, because no one else is going to do it for us. As you've seen, like
Right.
there's like the trans movement's not going to do it for us. Um,
Do you
then the
think
then the criticals aren't either.
do you think that this historical connection to Ray Blanchard's work in sexology and this like historical relationship to like Blanchardian typology, just given the negative connotations that his name has in the trans community, like do I mean, obviously, from like a purely scientific, objective perspective, all that doesn't matter. The truth is the truth. It is what it is. The theory is true or it's
Right.
not
That's
true.
sort of where I come from.
But
Yeah.
I almost wonder whether there needs to be like a total conceptual rehaul. Like some new researcher comes in and like, like I mean, it's kind of what you're doing in a way.
Yeah, I don't think the
But
research is wrong. The branding you're just coming for a rebrand,
yeah, we
kind
need
of.
need like a total rebrand that
And
is
like that's kind of what I've partially tried to do,
yeah.
That um
I mean, it like worked
well
on me because I totally bought into the Blanchard and Bailey. There's just a bunch of transphobes, and then like I just rejected that. And then I read your book and it's like, well, he's not like transphobic. He's just objective. There's a difference.
yeah.
So it's like, and that rebrand into auto heterosexuality was actually important because it helped me understand things better. And yeah, just like the term AGP, it's like
I think
it's
it's here to stay in terms of like
yeah,
the acronym for sure. People say that because it's an easier word to say,
yeah,
like you and I
yeah,
say it all the time.
yeah.
Um
Um, so, but I worry that this like historical connection to all this like bad blood between like the sexologists and the trans community is just going to like permanently prevent any bridge building and
it was
like
inevitable. Like no matter how Blanchard described it, the sort of autogynephilic imperative to be a woman to the greatest extent possible, like the transsexuals, they've committed the most intensely to the cross gender self, and that's why they're so comparatively well organized and very effective, and why they were some of the earliest people to oppose Ray Blanchard's research. But it's yeah, it's just part of the psychopathology of the thing. Like none of, as far as I could tell, none of the different types of subcultures around these types of autosexualities, there's not any one of those subcultures in which it's acceptable to say that, like Therians, it's not common among them to say, "Hey, I'm autozoophilic." They don't do that, and they would probably people would attack them intensely if they did, probably because it would cut a little too close to the bone for the rest of them. And I just think it's inevitable that there was going to be bad blood between the transsexuals and the sexologists, and that's just the nature of the psychology of the condition. And I I'm just I'm there's limits to how much we can yield to that psychopathology. Like that the trans movement, they can't get their way in all respects. Like I don't think their bid to completely redefine what a man and a woman are is ultimately going to succeed. People in everyday life, they have eyeballs, they can see. Um,
right. Yeah, it definitely seems to be the pendulum is swinging back
it
pretty
is, and when it swings
pretty
back, I don't
fast.
want
Like
it. Yeah, it's swinging back. I think part of that is Elon buying Twitter, but um, it is swinging back, and I just hope that when it does that, it doesn't. I want to minimize the damage to transsexuals. It's obvious they're obviously going to get damaged from this, and part of it is something they did. In terms of like pushing the transition kids and like under this under the whole like gender identity religion rationale, and also the trans women in female sports is like everyone that's not fully bought into the gender ideology stuff, they can just see that it's unfair with their eyes. Like you can see pictures, you can see video, and everyone just knows it's unfair unless they fully bought into the lie.
right.
And
Which is
it's
incredible how many actually like high IQ intelligent people have bought into that. It's like
well,
it's just
that's why it's easier to rationalize if you have a high IQ.
yeah. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I went through some incredible mental gymnastics as a trans activist. Oh my god. My book, I made some arguments in there that
Right.
oh
Well,
man.
and even now, like you, I think you still are very like intellectual, like quite in your head. Where, um, like for example, like I originally intended to talk to you more about your experience because that's like what I'm trying to do on my channel.
Oh
But
yeah.
then you got into the societal political stuff again because like, but that's where your head is at, and that's what you're thinking about, all this like abstract high level stuff, and that's just part of having a smarter brain, I think.
Yeah, I just yeah, no. I just spend too much time on like juicy Twitter stuff.
Yeah, no, like I would say it um something I found useful is I don't follow the ones that are overtly hateful to AGPs.
Yeah, I don't follow like Kelly J. Keene and that whole like
Oh, yeah, well, not even people
group.
near that level of hate, but like even ones that are milder than her. Like,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's encouraging Sasha Ayed, she like tweeted about that video I made yesterday, and I think yeah, that's like encouraging to see these, sort of
yeah,
feminist leaders within the GC movement sort of like starting. I think, I'm starting to see more conversations of, talking like with AGPs, and sort of like the AGPs are starting to tell their own stories rather than let everyone else tell their stories for them.
right, and that's what we have to do.
Right. But yeah, I
With
think,
other yeah,
but going back to what you said at the beginning, I think it's tough because to a large extent, the gender critical movement is like a female led political movement, and so in that sense, it's just sort of
yeah.
like, you know, yeah, like not huge fans of men in general. So and then like AGP men sort of like kind of like the lowest on the totem pole and their eyeballs as far as like, I mean, just go back to like Janice Raymond, and it's like
Yeah.
the transsexual empire, it's like this,
I think
conspiracy
that's why
theory.
we have to build our own thing. Like, if the I don't think the self-aware AGPs are they're gonna as you saw from the blue dress incident, the sort of, immune system of the gender critical movement is gonna try to expel all the AGPs, regardless of their actual behavior or anything. It's, it's sort of like a female supremacist movement, and it wants to expel as many men as it can,
Right,
and we can't expect them to be understanding of us. We can do is talk about our experience and be reasonable and be kind, and then just let the evolutionary process of discourse, go wherever it goes.
right.
But like
I
that's yeah, we gotta talk for ourselves.
Yeah, I do think it's tough though because like a lot of AGPs, they have this like nice guy symptom where like they just want to make the feminists happy, basically. Like they like don't want to take a um yeah, they just sort of like cater to that like way too much.
Right, yeah, because there's like an idealization of women, and you sort of, yield to what they say is true. Like, I get that, but I think it's also possible to disagree with them and upset them, but, like, not do it in an unkind way. Like,
Right,
you can disagree in a kind manner, but still be firm about it, and they may get upset, but that's their feelings to deal with.
right, right. Because you know there's just gonna be probably, reactions to like us having this conversation. Oh, these two men, talking. They're classic men talking about saying bad things about feminists. A bunch of misogynists or, or whatever. Like,
Yeah, maybe some will
so
say
yeah, I
that, but,
think
like, it doesn't matter.
yeah, 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 yeah. It's like having that like it's like g- going back to having like your own frame of reference and like not letting other people
Right.
define your frame of reference, which it's been like really key to me.
It's not in our control. Yeah, just, like, not having an internal locus of control instead of the external one.
Right,
I
right.
I noticed that we're, above 2 hours here, and we should probably wrap it up soon. Is there anything, um I what I usually like to ask is, like, is there anything that like, for any, like, autogynephiles that come across this video, is there anything that you've learned or that you want them to know that might help them?
Um, so there's this video out there, maybe you've seen it, called The Honey Badger. It's like this like it's like a funny video about
That one
the
from,
like
like, the 2000s?
yeah, it's like this old video
Yeah.
about the like honey badger and this funny narrative, and it's like the whole theme of the honey badger
Is
is
it to be the honey badger? Is that what
yeah,
you're saying?
the honey badger does not give a fuck about anyone or
Yeah.
anything. So like that is sort of like I think the best attitude to all this is like if you want to embrace your AGP, you got to learn to be like the honey badger. You got to, but at the same time, I also want to emphasize that just because you say fuck it to all norms of society, that does not necessarily provide adequate justification um, for, you know, like joining the women's sports team or whatever. No, you have to be sensible about this. Like,
Well,
like,
yeah, honey badger within limits,
yeah, it's like,
right?
because I think it's tempting for AGPs to be like, oh, I'm embracing myself. I'm true to myself. Fuck everyone. Fuck everything. Fuck all gender norms. Fuck all normativity. Like, screw you. I'm gonna do what I want, when I want, how I want. And it's like that is important, I think, to have that attitude, but it can also come from a place of male entitlement and lacking the self-awareness that that is male entitlement to some extent can start making you feel like entitled to encroach on all these things that are just going to cause you problems in your life psychologically. So if you want to embrace all this, my advice would be learn to say fuck it, be the honey badger, but also be aware that there are alternative pathways to being fully yourself as an organophile without necessarily going this full blown pathway that inevitably brings you into conflict with you know female like the females right to their own spaces and stuff so and so yeah, I think it's sort of about like because yeah, I see it all the time where like the AGP sort of like it's just start living their true life and it just sort of like they stop thinking. So
Right.
or they
Yeah,
just
so
feel like yeah. Oh, go ahead.
I think that's a good note to end on that, be the honey badger, but in a civilized, thoughtful way.
Yeah. It's like while it is important to like be true to yourself and like actualize your own desires, it is also important to realize that you are a member of society. It's like the classic like we live in a society. I think it's like a Seinfeld like line in
Yeah.
Sansa. But yeah, we live in a society, and that society is structured around the sex binary, and a lot of our institutions are structured around that. And you're just gonna make your life easier if you like can fit into that and be the honey badger and be your glamorous feminine self too. So yeah, that's my advice.
Alright. Yeah, with that said, thanks for coming on my channel, Ray. Um, and, I'm gonna end recording now.